The Dawson house was no different from the others on Maple Street in suburban Columbus, Ohio. One story, with chipped paint on the patio and an unkept lawn, it was a typical working-class dwelling. Monday morning greeted Vera Dawson with the usual bustle. In her 38, she looked tired, but still retained remnants of the beauty that had once attracted Robert. "Casey, get up! You're going to be late for work!" Faith shouted, standing at the stove. She was flipping scrambled eggs and sipping cheap coffee at the same time. Robert, a large man with graying stubble, entered the kitchen. His tired look spoke of many years as a trucker. "Got your bag packed?" Vera asked without turning around. "Yeah, I'm leaving in an hour. I'll probably be back in 2 weeks, maybe later." He glanced at his watch. "It's a long flight to the West Coast and back." At that moment, Casey, Robert's 23-year-old daughter from his first marriage, appeared in the kitchen. Her hair was dyed dark purple, and her face read the usual irritation. She sat silently at the table, avoiding looking at Vera. "Do you want me to cook for you too?" Vera asked. "No," Casey replied briefly, pulling cereal out of the cupboard. Robert paid no attention to the tension between the women. It was familiar in their 7 years together. He kissed Vera on the cheek, ruffled his daughter's hair, and left to check the truck before the long drive. When the door closed behind Robert, silence hung in the kitchen. Faith and Casey moved side by side like two magnets with identical poles, diligently pushing away from each other. "Shift is until what time?" Faith broke the silence. "Till 9, Casey mumbled, rinsing off her bowl. "Me too. It's a full day at the diner today." Casey didn't answer anything. An hour later, the house was empty. Workdays at Jenny's Diner were always the same: the bustle, the smell of grease, the tired customers. Faith delivered the orders, smiling and listening to the occasional compliment. Life passed by, as it had for the 11 years she'd worked here. She wiped down the tables and thought about her life. When she was young, Faith had dreamed of more, maybe college, traveling. But meeting Robert had changed everything. He was kind, reliable, though not overly ambitious, and his little daughter seemed so sweet at the time. No one had warned Vera that adolescence would turn this sweet girl into a sullen and withdrawn person. "Vera, table 4 is waiting." The diner owner's shout brought her back to reality. That same day, at a supermarket across town, Casey was punching groceries through the checkout line, wishing she were anywhere but here. She hated this job, the monotonous, meaningless work. She hated this city, this house, this life, and most of all, Vera's presence in their family. Casey still remembered when her father had brought Vera into the house. She was 16 and just beginning to recover from the loss of her mother. And then there she was, young, beautiful, trying to replace her mother. Casey hadn't accepted her then, and she didn't accept her now. "Need a bag?" she mechanically asked another customer. The evening brought coolness and silence to the Dawson home. Faith took off her uniform and showered. Casey hadn't yet returned from the supermarket where she worked as a cashier. The house seemed bigger and empty without Robert. Faith poured herself a glass of cheap wine. The special ritual of the first evening when her husband was away on a voyage was the little freedom she allowed herself. She turned on the old TV, found some show, and settled down on the couch. Robert disliked such programs, calling them women's nonsense. But Faith found some comfort in them. The creak of the front door heralded Casey's return. She entered the kitchen, dropping her bag on the floor. "Rough day?" Faith asked. "Same as always," Casey shrugged. She opened the refrigerator, pulled out a beer, and sat down across from her stepmother. "Do you want wine instead of beer?" Faith offered unexpectedly. Casey looked at her in surprise, but nodded. In another situation, they would have just gone to their rooms, each with their own drink. But something was different today. Maybe it was the tiredness. Maybe it was the loneliness. Maybe it was just the emptiness of the house without Robert that created a strange sense of freedom. The second glass of wine was followed by a third. The conversation, stilted at first, flowed more freely. They talked about work, about annoying clients, about plans. "I hate this town," Casey said. "I want to get out of here, start over, anywhere but here." "I understand," Faith replied quietly. "I had dreams like that once too." "What happened?" "Life," Faith smiled sadly. Just life. First I met your father, then there was this house, work. Days add up into years, and then one day you realize your dreams were left somewhere far behind. Do you have regrets? Casey asked, taking another sip. Faith hesitated for a moment. It was a difficult question, one she avoided asking herself. Sometimes, she answered honestly. But your father is a good man. He makes me feel safe. Safe is not happy, Casey observed. And how do you know what happiness is? Faith asked with sudden bitterness. You're so young, you have everything ahead of you. I know it's not my life here. Casey stood up, staggered and leaned on the table. Too much wine. Are you okay? Faith stepped closer, supporting her stepdaughter by the elbow. Their eyes met, and something changed in the air between them. The tension that had always existed took on a new hue. Neither one remembered who had made the first move. Perhaps it was Casey, whose lips were suddenly on Faith's, or Faith, whose hands had first touched Casey's face. It was a moment of madness, as if both of them had crossed an invisible line they didn't even know existed. They kissed greedily, frantically, with a fury that was so unlike their usual restrained interactions. Faith's hands tangled in Casey's purple hair. Casey's hand slid under her stepmother's homemade t-shirt. Faith pulled away first. We shouldn't, she began, but Casey pulled her to her again. Don't say anything, she whispered. Just let's not think, at least for tonight. And they didn't think. Not about the consequences, not about Robert, not about what it all meant. They were just falling into the abyss that had suddenly opened up before them. Morning brought a hangover and a realization of what had happened. Faith woke up in her bed alone, but signs of Casey's presence were everywhere. She got up and found her stepdaughter in the kitchen with a cup of coffee. It was a mistake, Casey said without looking at her. Yeah, Faith agreed. It won't happen again. They both knew they were lying. The day passed in a strange tension. They avoided each other, leaving the room when the other entered. In the evening, Faith had gone to her friend's house to avoid the temptation of being alone with Casey, but it didn't help. 2 days later, they found themselves together again, this time sober, without the excuse of alcohol. And it was even worse, because they'd both consciously chosen this path. Their connection was like a drug, forbidden, destructive, but irresistible. They didn't talk about feelings, just fell into that abyss over and over again, knowing they would crash someday. Sometimes Casey stayed the night in Vera's room. Sometimes they found privacy during the day when they both got home from work early. They didn't discuss the future, didn't make plans. Both realized that this story could not have a happy ending. Faith noticed that Casey began to smile more often. Strangely, their forbidden connection seemed to be making her softer, calmer. Maybe the passion they shared was the valve that allowed the years of built-up tension between them to be released. 2 weeks later, Vera noticed a strange spot on her skin. At first, she didn't think much of it, writing it off as an allergy or irritation. After 3 weeks, she began to feel tired, which she put down to work and sleepless nights with Casey. After 4, she developed a fever that lasted several days. You need to see a doctor, Casey said as she watched Faith swallow another antipyretic pill. It's just the flu. Or a cold. Faith brushed it off. You should go anyway. You don't look well. Faith noticed a shadow of concern on Casey's face, and it surprised her. Had things really gone so far that they were starting to really care about each other? The clinic greeted Faith with sterile cleanliness and the smell of antiseptic. The line moved slowly, and Vera was tempted to leave several times. But something, maybe a strange premonition, kept her in place. The doctor, a young woman with tired eyes, examined her and ordered tests. It could be a viral illness, but I'd like to rule out other possibilities, she said, filling out a referral. Fever, rash, fatigue. Better get it checked out. What do you mean? Faith was wary. Just a standard check for various infections, the doctor replied evasively. We'll have the results in a week. The week passed in anxious anticipation. The relationship with Casey continued, though both realized that with Robert's return, they'd have to call it quits, or at least become a lot more cautious. What are we going to do when Dad gets back? Casey asked one day, lying in Vera's bed. The same thing we always do. Pretend, Faith replied, looking up at the ceiling. What if he finds out? He won't find out if we're careful. He'd hate us, Casey said quietly. Both of us. That's why he can never find out. The call from the outpatient clinic sounded like a thunderclap. Mrs. Dawson, you need to come in. There are results that need to be discussed. The nurse's voice sounded neutral, but Faith felt a chill of fear. The doctor's office seemed smaller than last time. Or maybe it was the walls pressing down on Vera when she heard the diagnosis. You're positive for HIV, the doctor said, looking at her with sympathy. The world turned upside down. Vera felt the ground go from under her feet. This is impossible, she whispered. Yeah, I only have my husband and Casey. The thought pierced her like lightning. Casey, with her past she'd never told. Casey, with her secrets. You need to let your partner know, the doctor continued, and start treatment as soon as possible. It's not a death sentence now like it used to be. With the right therapy, you can lead an almost normal life. Almost normal. Those words echoed in Vera's head as she walked home. An almost normal life, with a disease that was passed down to her by her own stepdaughter. Vera returned home in a daze. Her mind was spinning with images of a future that now seemed stolen. How would she tell Robert? How would she explain? Or would she lie for the rest of her life? Casey noticed the change as soon as Faith crossed the threshold. What's wrong? She asked, seeing her stepmother's pale face. Faith looked at her with new eyes, at this young woman who seemed so fragile and innocent now, who had ruined her life. Do you know you have HIV? Faith asked bluntly. Casey's face changed, becoming a mask of fear and guilt. And in that moment, Faith realized her hunch was correct. How long have you known? Faith asked, feeling everything go cold inside. A few months, Casey answered quietly. Yeah, I didn't think I could get infected. I'm on medication. But you didn't tell me! Faith's voice trailed off into a scream. You let it happen! I didn't want you to find out. I was afraid you'd tell your father. About what? About the illness or about us? Vera asked bitterly. About the disease. I got it from a girl I was seeing before all this. My father never knew about my orientation, my relationship. If he had found out, anger, fear, and betrayal mingled in Vera's soul. You've ruined my life. How will I look your father in the eye now? What will I tell him? Nothing. You won't say anything. Casey's voice took on a new note. Because then you'll have to explain how it happened. No, if you get treatment, you can live normally. Casey tried to move closer, but Faith recoiled. Don't come near me. It's over between us. We'll never be again. I can't even look at you. Something changed in Casey's eyes. Fear was replaced by calculation. What if I tell my father about us? What do you think he'll do? Faith stiffened. Are you threatening me? Just saying we both have secrets, and I need money. Money? Faith couldn't believe her ears. After everything you've done? I need to get out of here, start a new life. And that requires money. Casey's eyes were cold. 2,000 to start. Then we'll see. I don't have that kind of money. Find it, or I'll tell my father everything as soon as he gets back. Faith looked at her stepdaughter and didn't recognize her. Where had that Casey gone, who just yesterday had been lying next to her, whispering tender words? Or was it always a mask, an act? Give me time, Faith finally said. I'll think of something. You have a week before your father gets back. Casey turned and left for her room, leaving Faith alone in the kitchen. That night they slept in separate rooms. Faith lay staring at the ceiling and thought about how her life had turned into a nightmare. The only consolation was that Robert wouldn't get infected if they were careful. But the thought of having to lie to him for the rest of her life was unbearable. Outside the window, the rain began to fall. The drops pounded on the roof, as if counting down the time until the inevitable catastrophe. Faith knew there was no way out. She couldn't let Casey tell Robert about their relationship. It would destroy him. But to live under blackmail, with this disease, with this betrayal, how much longer could she take it? Faith closed her eyes and tried to sleep, but the image of Casey, then tender and vulnerable, then cold and calculating, kept her awake. At what point had everything gone wrong? At what point had forbidden passion turned into a trap from which there was no escape? $2,000, a sum that for many would be insignificant, but for Vera Dawson, it seemed insurmountable. A waitress with just above minimum wage, no savings, and a credit card already overloaded with debt. She stood at the ATM and looked at her account balance, $326.40. It wasn't enough. Catastrophically not enough. 3 days passed in agonizing attempts to find the money. Vera took extra shifts at the diner, called old friends, even pawned her only valuable piece of jewelry, a gold ring given by her mother on her 18th birthday. In the end, she managed to raise just over $800. "That's all I have," she told Casey that evening, placing the money on the kitchen table. Casey counted the bills, and her face contorted with anger. "We agreed on $2,000. I can't get more than that. It's all my savings, plus I pawned the ring and took extra shifts." "Not enough." Casey pushed the money away. "I need the full amount before my father returns." "Casey, that's impossible. You know how much money I make." "Then take out a loan, or borrow from someone." Casey shrugged. "I don't care how you do it, but if I don't get the rest of the money by Friday, my dad will find out everything." Faith looked at the girl who had shared a bed with her not so long ago and didn't recognize her. Where had that tenderness gone, those moments of intimacy that seemed so sincere? Or was it all just an act from the beginning? "Why are you doing this?" Vera asked, feeling the tears coming. "Why can't you just forget everything and move on?" "Because I don't want to move on with my life here," Casey retorted. "I want to leave, start a new life. And to do that, I need money." "What about medical treatment? You need regular tests, medication." "I'll take care of it myself, just get the money." With those words, Casey walked out of the kitchen, leaving Vera alone with an unsolvable problem. The next day brought a new wave of despair. Vera called several banks, trying to apply for a loan, but was turned down everywhere because of her low credit rating. She even considered borrowing from her coworkers, but shame and fear of exposure kept her away. The diner was quiet, as it usually was on Tuesdays. Faith was wiping down the counter when the owner, Jenny, approached her. "Are you okay? You look exhausted." Faith tried to smile. "Just tired, nothing serious." "Are you sure? You've been kind of pale the last few days, and those extra shifts, do you need money?" Faith froze. Was her desperation really that obvious? "A little financial trouble," she admitted reluctantly, "but I'll manage." Jenny looked at her questioningly. "If you need an advance, you just say the word. Not a big one, of course, but it might help." "Thank you, Jenny. Yeah, think about it." This conversation made Vera realize how desperate her situation was. Even if she raised the first amount, what would happen then? Casey wouldn't stop at 2,000. There would be new demands, new threats, and so on ad infinitum, or until there was nothing left to take away. She returned home that evening with a firm resolve to put an end to the blackmail. She didn't know exactly how, but she felt she had to try. Casey was sitting in the living room, looking something up on her phone. She didn't even look up when Faith walked in. "We need to talk," Faith said, trying to make her voice sound confident. "About the money? Did you get the rest of it?" "No, and I won't. It's impossible." Casey finally looked up. Her eyes read irritation. "Then we have nothing to talk about." "No, there is. About what you're doing. It's called blackmail, Casey. It's a felony." "So is contracting HIV while concealing your status," Casey parried. "So we're both in trouble with the law, right?" Faith felt the blood drain from her face. "Did you do this on purpose? Infected me on purpose?" Casey hesitated for a moment, and Faith saw something in her eyes. Fear? Regret? But the moment of vulnerability passed quickly. "What difference does it make? The result is the same. Either you pay, or your husband finds out his wife slept with his daughter and got her a gift for life." Those words hit Vera like a slap in the face. All that warmth, that tenderness that had once sprung up between them. Was it all a lie? Or had Casey become so hardened that she no longer remembered those moments? "I'll talk to Robert myself," Faith said after a long pause. "I'll tell him everything. About us, about the disease, everything." Now it was Casey's turn to pale. "You won't do that?" "I will, because I can't go on living like this, Under blackmail, in fear. I'd rather suffer the pain of the truth once than die every day from a lie. He'll hate you. Casey stepped closer, her voice turning menacing. We'll kick you out of the house, leave you with nothing. Maybe, but it will be my decision, my choice, not your weapon against me. Casey laughed, but there was no mirth in her laughter. You're bluffing. You'll never admit it to him. You're too afraid of losing your cozy little life. You're wrong. I already lost it the moment you started blackmailing me. Their confrontation was interrupted by the sound of a key in the lock. Both women froze, staring at the front door. Robert Dawson entered the house, tired but smiling. Surprise! The flight ended early and I decided not to give any notice. He fell silent, noticing the tension between the women. What's going on? Nothing, Casey said quickly. Just a little argument about domestic matters. Robert shifted his gaze to Faith, who stood pale and trembling. Faith? Are you okay? This was the moment of truth. Faith could have said anything right now, put an end to the lies and fear, but looking into her husband's tired, kind eyes, she couldn't. Yes, it's okay. Just a little misunderstanding. I'm so glad you're back. She walked over and hugged Robert, feeling Casey watching them with a cold smile. She had won this round, and they both knew it. Dinner passed in a strange atmosphere. Robert talked about his trip without noticing the tension between the women. Faith barely touched her food, while Casey threw occasional triumphant glances at her. After dinner, Robert left to take a shower while Casey helped Faith with the dishes. When the sound of water from the bathroom drowned out their voices, Casey leaned over to Faith and whispered, I'm still waiting for the money, the full amount, and don't you dare say anything to him. Faith answered nothing, mechanically wiping her plate. Something inside her broke. Fear was replaced by despair, and despair by emptiness. The next 2 days passed in agonizing tension. Robert sensed that something was wrong, but wrote off Vera's tension as fatigue. Casey, on the other hand, seemed to enjoy the situation, at times defiantly leaving notes with sums of money where only Vera could find them. On Friday morning, Vera found a new note in her purse. Till 6 tonight, 3,000, or I'll tell. The amount had gone up. Now Casey was demanding even more, knowing that Faith wouldn't be able to raise even the original amount. This wasn't blackmail for money, it was a cruel game of humiliation. Faith spent the entire day as if in a fog. At the diner, she broke 2 plates and mixed up her orders. Jenny sent her home early, concerned about her condition. Faith walked home, realizing she was cornered. She couldn't pay, couldn't confess to Robert, couldn't continue to live under blackmail. There was no way out. The house was quiet. Robert was at work. He had taken only 1 day off after a long voyage and was back to local transportation. Faith hoped Casey wasn't home either. But Casey was there, sitting in the kitchen with a cup of coffee, as if waiting for her. It's 6 o'clock and there's no money, she said without saying hello. I can't get them, Casey. It's impossible. Then I'm calling my dad. Casey pulled out her phone. Faith felt something shatter inside. You're not going to do that. I will, right now. Casey started dialing a number, and Faith lunged toward her, trying to snatch the phone away. A struggle ensued. They knocked over a chair, a cup of coffee crashing to the floor. Casey was younger and stronger, but desperation gave Faith strength. Give me the phone, Faith shouted, clawing at her stepdaughter's arm. Get your hands off me, you crazy woman. Casey shoved her away, and Faith flew back to the kitchen table. Faith's hand fumbled for the handle of the kitchen knife. What are you going to do with that? Casey grinned, noticing the movement. Kill me? Only complicate your situation. I just want you to leave me alone. Faith's voice shook. Stop blackmailing me and we'll forget about everything. I can't. Casey reached for the phone again. You didn't give me the money. Now my father will find out everything. Faith took a step forward, clutching the knife. She didn't intend to use it. She just wanted to scare Casey, make her stop. Put the phone down, Casey. Or what? You gonna hit me? Casey laughed. You won't be able to. You're weak, Faith. You've always been weak. Please, just let's talk. There has to be another solution. There is no other solution. It's either money or the truth. And since there's no money, Casey started dialing again, and Faith took another step forward. She wanted to snatch the phone away, but Casey pushed her away, and Faith lost her balance. It all happened in seconds. Faith fell backward, still clutching the knife. Casey instinctively stepped forward, trying to catch her or push her away. Faith never realized. The point of the knife entered Casey's body with unexpected ease. Casey's eyes flew open in shock. A red stain was blurring on her t-shirt. You hit me," she whispered incredulously. "No, I didn't. Casey!" Faith released the knife from her hands and rushed to her stepdaughter, who was slowly settling to the floor. Blood was spreading across the kitchen floor at an alarming rate. Faith tried to clamp the wound, but blood was seeping between her fingers. Casey wheezed and coughed, clinging to her stepmother's arms with unexpected strength. "Hold on, Casey. I'll call an ambulance. You'll be okay," Faith said frantically, trying to reach for the phone. But it was too late. Casey's grip on her arm loosened, her eyes glazed over. A final exhale escaped her chest and her body collapsed. Faith froze, unable to believe what was happening. It couldn't be happening, couldn't be real. But the blood on her hands, on the floor, on her clothes was all too real. "Casey, please, no," she whispered, shaking the lifeless body. "Please don't die." But Casey didn't answer. She was dead, her eyes staring at the ceiling, seeing nothing. Faith didn't know how long she had spent like that, sitting on the floor in a pool of blood, holding Casey's body. Minutes? Hours? Reality seemed blurred, unreal. Finally, she came to her senses and realized the situation. She had killed her stepdaughter, killed a human being. Was it unintentional? Was it self-defense? Or was it? Would they believe her? Robert. What would Robert say? Panic overwhelmed Vera. She must call the police, tell the truth. But then the truth would come out, about their relationship, about the blackmail, about the illness. Vera looked at her watch. It was almost 7. Robert was usually back by 9, but sometimes he was late. That left her little time to do anything about it. Not quite knowing what she was doing, Vera began frantically wiping blood from the floor. From the furniture, she stripped off her bloody clothes, stuffed them into a garbage bag. Then, acting as if in a trance, she dragged Casey's body into the bathroom and laid it in the empty tub. What was next? Faith didn't know. She needed to get rid of the body, but how? Where? And would she even be able to do that? She needed to think, concentrate. But her thoughts were jumbled, her hands were shaking. All she could think was, "I killed her. I killed Casey." Faith went back into the kitchen, checking for traces of blood. It looked clean, but the knife was still lying on the floor, covered in Casey's blood. She picked it up, washed it thoroughly under hot water, then returned to the bathroom and sat on the edge of the tub, staring at her stepdaughter's body. The ringing of the phone made her wince. It was Robert. "Hi, honey." His voice sounded strangely cheerful. "I'm with the guys. We're celebrating Tom's birthday. I think I'm going to stay late. I'll be back late. Maybe even stay at his place if we get totally hung up." Faith felt a surge of relief that was immediately replaced by shame. "Of course, darling. Have fun. Is Casey home?" "No, she said she was going to a friend's house. It's going to be late," Faith lied, trying to make her voice sound normal. "Okay, I'll see you tomorrow then. Love you." "Love you too." Faith hung up the phone and took a deep breath. Luck, a small respite in a string of disasters. She had more time. An hour later, the doorbell rang. Faith flinched and froze. Who could it be? Could Robert have decided to come back after all? Cautiously, she walked to the door and looked through the peephole. On the threshold stood Nancy Wilson, their neighbor, a nosy woman in her 50s who always knew all the neighborhood news. "Faith, are you home?" came her voice. Faith hesitated. Should she ignore the call or open it? If she didn't answer, Nancy might suspect something, start asking questions. "Coming!" she shouted, taking a quick look around herself. There seemed to be no trace of blood. She opened the door, trying to smile. "Hi, Nancy." "Hi, honey. Sorry for the late visit, but I wanted to borrow some sugar. I'm having company over and I'm out of sugar." "Sure." Faith let her neighbor inside, praying to all the gods that she didn't ask to use the bathroom. "Let's go to the kitchen." To her relief, Nancy followed her into the kitchen, chatting about some neighborhood gossip. Faith answered mechanically, pouring sugar into a bag and thinking only of escorting her neighbor out as quickly as possible. "Where are Robert and Casey?" Nancy asked, looking around. "Robert's at a friend's house, celebrating a birthday, and Casey's at a friend's." "I see, and I heard some noise at your place an hour ago. I thought maybe there was a fight." Nancy looked at Vera questioningly. "No, it was the television. I was watching an action movie." Faith felt a cold sweat running down her back. "Ah, I see." Nancy seemed satisfied with the explanation. She picked up the bag of sugar. "Thank you, dear. I won't bother you again." Faith walked her to the door, locked it, and leaned her forehead against the cool wood. This was dangerous. Too dangerous. Something had to be done about the body, and fast. She went back into the bathroom and looked at Casey's body again. She couldn't carry it alone, but she couldn't leave it here either. Sooner or later, Robert would come back and discover it. Faith began to think feverishly. The car. She has a car, an old sedan. If she could drag the body to the garage, load it into the trunk. But then where to? Where would she hide the body so it wouldn't be found? Only places from crime movies came to mind. A forest, a lake, a construction site. But in real life, none of that seemed possible. She'd never be able to get the body into the woods without being seen, and she didn't have the strength or skill to dig a hole. The clock showed almost 10 o'clock at night. Robert had said he would stay late, perhaps until morning. Time was short, but there was still time. Vera decided to act. First, to get rid of any traces of the crime in the house. She checked the kitchen again thoroughly, making sure all the bloodstains had been scrubbed away. Then she returned to the bathroom, filled the tub with water to wash the blood off Casey's body. It was creepy, washing the body of the man she'd killed. But now was not the time for emotion. She must think clearly. A plan began to form in her head. Not ideal, risky, but better than nothing. She would wait until deep into the night, when the neighbors were asleep, and try to move the body to the car. If Robert stayed at a friend's house until morning, she'd have a chance. Faith sat on the edge of the tub and covered her face with her hands. How had she gotten to this point? How had her life turned into a nightmare thriller? Just a few weeks ago, everything had been normal. Not perfect, but normal. And now, she's sitting next to her stepdaughter's corpse, planning how to dispose of the body. Outside the window, the rain began to fall. The drops pounded on the roof like a clock counting down the time left. A long night full of fear and despair awaited Vera. And somewhere in the back of her mind, she knew that even if she managed to hide the body, the truth would still come out, sooner or later. It always does. Robert Dawson came home Sunday morning, hungover, and feeling guilty for leaving his wife alone all weekend. He expected to see Casey at the kitchen table too, as usual, staring at her phone. But it was only Faith in the kitchen, with a cup of coffee and a strangely detached look. "Good morning," he said, kissing his wife on the top of her head. "Where's Casey?" Faith flinched at his touch. "She's gone." "Gone? Where?" "Don't know exactly. Said she needed to start a new life. Packed up her things and left last night." Robert frowned. "And she didn't even say goodbye to me? That's odd. Has she called?" "Not yet." Faith looked away. "Maybe she'll call later." Robert pulled out his cell phone and dialed his daughter's number. "That's odd. No answer. And it's not even ringing. It goes straight to voicemail." "Maybe the phone's dead," Vera shrugged, trying to speak calmly. "Or she's out of range." "Maybe," Robert agreed uncertainly. "But where would she go? It's not like she has money for tickets." "She was talking about some friend in Cincinnati, maybe to see her." Robert continued to call his daughter throughout the day, but the phone remained unavailable. By evening, his concern had turned to alarm. "This isn't like her," he said, pacing the living room. "Yeah, we haven't always gotten along, but she's never disappeared like this without giving me a heads up." "Maybe she just wants to be alone for a while," Faith suggested. "You know how Casey can be. She needs space sometimes." But Robert wasn't complacent. He called every acquaintance of his daughter's whose numbers he had. No one had seen Casey. By Monday morning, he was desperate. "I'm going to the police," he declared. "Something's wrong. I can feel it." Vera tried to talk him out of it, but to no avail. At 10 in the morning, they were sitting in the police station filling out a missing persons report. Unfortunately, Mr. Dawson, we can't start looking for an adult who simply won't answer his phone until 72 hours from now, the officer on duty explained. But I know something is wrong. My daughter would never do something like this. The officer looked sympathetic but adamant. Believe me, it happens more often than you think. Young people leave home, wanting to start a new life. Most come back within a week. But 72 hours later, Casey still hadn't shown up. Her cell phone remained unavailable, none of her friends had seen her. And now Ohio police have actually launched an investigation. Detective Rachel Coleman arrived at the Dawson home Wednesday afternoon. A middle-aged woman with tired eyes and a notebook in hand. She methodically questioned Robert and Vera about the last few days before Casey disappeared. "And you say you last saw her Friday night?" she asked Vera. "Yes. Around 8 o'clock in the evening, she said she was leaving, packed a bag, and left." "What did she leave in? Did she have a car?" "No, I think she took a bus or hitched a ride with someone." "A hitchhiker? With who?" "I don't know." Faith looked away. "She didn't say." Detective Coleman took notes, watching Vera's reactions carefully. "And she didn't leave any note? Didn't say exactly where she was going?" "No, just that she needed to start a new life." "Has she had any problems lately? Something that might explain such a sudden decision?" Faith hesitated. "I don't know, aren't really close," Robert interjected. "Casey's always had a hard time relating to Faith. You know, they never really got along much." The detective nodded. "I see. Did Casey have money problems? Debts?" "No, I don't think so." Robert shook his head. "She worked as a cashier at the supermarket. I used to help her with her bills." Detective Coleman continued asking questions for another half hour, then asked permission to look around Casey's room. "Sure." Robert escorted her upstairs. Casey's room was small but cozy. A poster of a rock band on the wall, a few books on a shelf, a computer on the desk. The detective methodically looked around every corner. "Looks like she's really packed," Coleman observed as she opened the empty dresser drawers. "But not all of it. I wonder..." She opened Casey's laptop. "Do you know the password?" Robert shook his head. "No. Casey's always been very private about these things. We'll take it back for forensics. Maybe there are clues in there about her plans." Walking back down to the kitchen, Detective Coleman noticed a strange stain on the floor near the refrigerator. "What is that?" she asked, leaning closer. Faith turned pale. "Spilled gravy the other day. Can't get it out." The detective touched the stain with her finger, then held it up to her nose. Her gaze grew sharper. "Mrs. Dawson, would you mind if our forensics team took a look at your kitchen?" "Why?" Faith's voice shook. "Casey's just gone. She's not missing." "It's standard procedure," the detective replied, "just in case." The next day, the Dawson house was filled with forensic investigators. They collected samples, took photographs, and used chemical reagents on various surfaces. "What are they looking for?" Robert asked nervously, watching the process. "Any trace evidence that might help us understand what happened to your daughter," replied Detective Coleman. "It's a routine procedure." But Faith knew it wasn't. She could see it in the detective's face. Coleman suspected something. The search for Casey widened. The police interviewed neighbors, checked surveillance cameras, tracked possible routes, but there was no sign of the girl. A week after Casey's disappearance, Detective Coleman returned to the Dawson home with forensic results. "Mr. and Mrs. Dawson," she began, sitting at their kitchen table. "We've received the results of the analysis of the stains in your kitchen. It's blood, and it belongs to Casey." Robert stared at the detective, stunned. "What? How is that possible?" "That's exactly the question I'd like to ask your wife." Coleman shifted her gaze to Vera. "Mrs. Dawson, I think you have some explaining to do." Vera sat as still as a statue. "I don't understand. Casey's just gone." "Mrs. Dawson, we found your stepdaughter's blood in the kitchen, in the bathroom, on the hallway carpet. And it's not a drop from a cut. It's a significant amount of blood." "There has to be some explanation," Robert interjected. "Maybe she hurt herself before she left?" "This amount of blood suggests serious trauma," the detective continued. "In addition, we found traces of blood in the trunk of your car, Mrs. Dawson." Faith felt the world around her begin to blur. She knew this moment would come, knew it, but hoped to delay it as long as possible. "Robert," she whispered, "I'm so sorry." "Faith? What are you talking about?" He looked at her with horror. "Mrs. Dawson," the detective's voice became official. "Where is Casey Dawson?" Faith covered her face with her hands and burst into tears. She couldn't hold it in anymore. Fear, guilt, despair, it all came rushing out. "In the woods," she finally squeezed out. "By Miller Lake. There's an old cabin there. I left her there." Casey Dawson's body was found 2 hours later. It was hidden under the rotting boards of an old hunting cabin in the woods behind Miller Lake, about 20 miles from town. The corpse had already begun to decompose, but the cause of death was obvious: a stab wound to the abdomen. Vera was arrested and taken to the police station. Robert refused to go with her, remaining in shock and despair in their home, which was now a crime scene. In the interview room, Detective Coleman sat down across from Vera. "I want to hear the whole story, Mrs. Dawson, from beginning to end." Faith nodded. She felt strangely relieved. No more lies, no more hiding, no more fear. It was over. "It started when Robert left on the voyage," she began quietly. She told everything. About her strained relationship with Casey, about the wine night, about how they'd suddenly become lovers, about the HIV diagnosis, about the blackmail, about the growing demands for money. "She knew I couldn't get that amount of money," Vera said, "but she kept demanding. And then she threatened to tell Robert everything. I panicked. We started fighting over the phone, and the knife. I didn't want to kill her. I swear I didn't mean to." The detective took notes, occasionally asking clarifying questions, but mostly she let Vera speak freely. "What about HIV?" she asked finally. "Do you have proof of diagnosis?" "Yes. My medical records are at home, in my dresser drawer." Detective Coleman nodded. "We'll check it out. One last question. You claim Casey infected you and then blackmailed you. Is there any evidence of that?" "Just her word," Faith replied. "But I'm sure she knew of her status before our relationship. She was on medication, said she had it under control." After the interrogation, Vera was placed in a holding cell. A murder charge was imminent, but the severity was yet to be determined. Much depended on proving her story of blackmail and deliberate contamination. Detective Coleman returned to the Dawson home the next morning. Robert looked 10 years older. He sat on the couch, staring into the void. "Mr. Dawson, we need to check some details of your wife's history," the detective said. She mentioned medical records in the bedroom. Robert nodded without saying a word. The detective went upstairs and found Vera's paperwork. The HIV diagnosis was confirmed. The date matched the period Vera had described. "Mr. Dawson, were you aware of your daughter's health problems?" the detective asked, returning to the living room. "Health problems?" He raised a blank stare at her. "There's reason to believe that Casey had HIV even before the incident with your wife." Robert shook his head. No, that can't be. She would have told me." "It's not always easy to talk about these things," the detective observed gently, "especially with parents." The autopsy results confirmed the presence of HIV in Casey's system. What's more, analysis of the antiretroviral drugs in her bloodstream showed that she had been taking them for at least 6 months, long before her relationship with Vera. Detective Coleman returned to the station with the new information. The picture was becoming clearer, but there were still gaps. They found a diary at Casey's house. Most of the entries were about everyday things, but there were also references to her diagnosis, her fear of exposure, her hatred of her stepmother. "She will never replace Mom," Casey wrote. "She destroyed our family. Now I'm going to destroy hers." That entry, dated a month before their relationship began, was a key piece of evidence. Casey had been planning revenge against Vera long before their intimacy. Additional investigations at medical facilities in the city confirmed that Casey had been on the registry with an HIV diagnosis for over a year. Her ex-girlfriend, whom she had been dating prior to the incident with Vera, also turned out to be HIV positive and claimed to have been infected by Casey. "She never told me about her status," the girl told Detective Coleman. "I only found out after we broke up and I got sick." Vera's attorney used this evidence to argue that the murder was not premeditated, but rather the result of self-defense and extreme emotional distress after discovering the intentional contamination and subsequent blackmail. The county prosecutor agreed to reduce the charge from first-degree murder to manslaughter. Vera still faced prison time, but with the possibility of parole in a few years. Detective Coleman closed the Dawson case file. It was a dark tale of revenge, manipulation, and desperation. A story of a family destroyed from within by secrets and hatred. "Detective," the lieutenant called out to her as she was about to leave. "Good job. Tough case." Coleman nodded. "Yes. And the sad thing is, all of this could have been avoided if they'd just talked to each other, if they'd been honest, but they weren't. And the price of that lie proved exorbitant for everyone involved in this drama. Robert Dawson sold the house and left town. He could no longer live where he had lost both his daughter and his wife. He couldn't look people in the eye knowing that everyone was discussing his family tragedy. Vera Dawson began serving her sentence at the Ohio State Prison for Women. She received HIV treatment and wrote long letters to Robert that went unanswered. And Detective Rachel Coleman moved on to the next case, taking with her a lesson learned from the Dawson story. Sometimes the worst crimes begin not with hatred or greed, but with an inability to tell the truth to those we call loved ones.